we do for learning disabled students. It affects the kinds of accommodations that we give to students here and the kinds of accommodations they can expect to receive at other campuses. So I want to go over some of that. I want to talk primarily about the kinds of learning disabilities that students suffer. When somebody stops me in the hall and says, oh, this kid is learning disabled, and I look kind of blank, it's because it's real hard for me to think in terms of just learning disabled, because there are different types of learning disabilities, and the treatment that we give them isn't generalized. We do sometimes do the same thing, but for different reasons sometimes. But anyway, so we'll go through some of the types of disabilities that the students have. We're going to talk about some of the techniques that you can use, hopefully, in your classrooms. And I have a handout, which really I don't like to give because it's just kind of everything I can think of slapped down on a piece of paper, which is not necessarily the best way to go. But I'll also talk about some specific techniques for specific disabilities as we go through those. And I want to give you some research in preparation for talking to you learned colleagues. I've been trying to find some of the newest research, and lots of you have sent things to me that I haven't in the past had a chance to see, so hopefully I'll be able to share a little bit of that with you. I hope there's enough handouts for everybody. I ran out 30. I needed this room hold. You should have an outline and a little note card. Okay? Okay, let's just start with some background because I think it's important to have this before we go too much further. This is just a brief listing of the major laws that have been passed that affect learning disabled students, and it affects what I do with them here. It affects the college in terms of funding that the college gets. We are liable. We have to follow the regulations that have been passed for these students. You can just breeze through them. I won't read them all to you. The major law, 1975, 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, is the one that really started providing services in the elementary schools for learning disabled students.
Do we get funds for our things?
We do not get public funds for our LD students. We do, however, get funds in the form of financial aid, and because of those funds, we are expected to follow legislation that's passed. That's how we tie. But no, we don't get funding for X number of LD students. Anyway, 94-142 started to provide money and services for LD students in the elementary schools and into high school. And because of that, we are now seeing more of these students in college because they're realizing their potential and they're, reaching further. So I think that one had a major impact. One thing I want to mention about 94-142 is one of the aspects of that law was that these children had to be served in what they call the least restrictive alternative. And LRE is a very important concept in the elementary schools. That means that if a student is diagnosed as retarded or physically handicapped or hearing impaired or learning disabled, you can't shove them into a special class or a special school if that's not what's needed for them. If they can handle being taught in a regular classroom with what they use in all of this legislation as accommodations, then they have to be served in the larger environment with normal students, okay? Putting them off restricts them, okay? And I look at it kind of with the learning disabled students. If I provide too much support for them, I'm restricting them, okay? If we send them off to a college for only learning disabled students, we're restricting them. So it's important that they be in the mainstream of education. The least restrictive alternative is really important. You can see that there's two laws in 1990. Americans with Disabilities Act was just now signed, I think last summer. And this one is going to affect disabled people in general, including the learning disabled, in being discriminated against in any kind of education and public services. Okay? So there's new things happening. I was someplace the other day and I noticed they had a new wheelchair ramp installed, and I think it has to do with ADA. The way this is going to affect our students is primarily when they go to be employed. They can't be turned down from a job because they identify themselves as learning disabled. unless that learning disability affects their performance on that job. So let's say they have trouble with adding figures, they probably wouldn't get a job as an accountant, but they could, however, get a job in the company in another aspect. Okay? So that's really going to become important. They're just now starting to put that law into effect. And the Spear Dyslexia Bill is, that's a California bill. That's only in the state of California. And all that's doing, I can see this beginning to affect us, and I think what we're doing today as part of that is just to make faculty in high schools, elementary schools, and colleges aware of what dyslexia is. And I think here they're using the term dyslexia broadly. You will find as we go on, the term dyslexia has a very specific meaning, but they kind of use it in an overall way to encompass learning disabilities. But the goal of this bill is to just make people aware. It is not a mandate, there's nothing really associated with it in that regard. But you can see at the bottom that it does include colleges and universities. And it encourages colleges to provide training and ability to recognize, which you guys are really pretty good at anyway, I think. Okay, those are just some of the laws. I think that in putting these laws into effect, it becomes important to realize what a learning disability is. And I don't want to go into a lot of, do you mind the dog? Is somebody going to turn the lights on and off for me? I'm going to be going back to that. Yes, there is also a learning disability that's rigidity. You know? Potential is something that's really important. In identifying a learning disabled student, and I have definitions, but I've presented those to you before, I think. A learning disabled student is a student with average or above intelligence, okay? That has to be understood from the beginning. Their intelligence is better than average, usually. But there is some specific disability that makes it difficult for them to always demonstrate that, okay? So they may be an IQ of 140, 150, but they can't write things and make it legible on a piece of paper, but that doesn't mean that they're not smart. So there is some specific disability in an area, but they have to be average or above to fit the definition, okay? So some of the students we have here that we get real upset about all the time, I think it's important that we understand that all of those kids aren't learning disabled just because they're having trouble. There are very specific guidelines. When I provide services for them, if you get my little forms, it's because they provided documentation of that learning disability. They've been tested. Usually the assessment requires an IQ test as well as academic achievement testing. And what you look for, although it's becoming unpopular to phrase it this way, is a discrepancy between potential and an actual achievement. So that's the important factor that we have to look into. And there are lots of people that are real upset about that. They use a mathematical equation in the community colleges to determine whether or not there's enough discrepancy. Here at Marymount, I haven't done that. I kind of, I'm a little more flexible, but I do make sure that there's obvious learning disability there when I look at the evaluations that come in. Okay, so potential is real important. Students have to have the potential, and also least restrictive alternative, please remember when we talk about providing services for them. Thinking about what it feels like to have a learning disability, I was watching a TV program a few weeks ago, The Cosby Show. I don't know if anybody sees that, but Theo on Cosby has been diagnosed as dyslexic. So it's really kind of fun to see how he's dealing with that. And he had the most beautiful example, and I'm going to try to do it for you, although I'm not very good at this. He was trying to explain to another child that this is sort of what it's like to be dyslexic. You have all these little pieces of the puzzle, but you can't quite put them together to be in it. Okay? The learning disabled or the dyslexic student often, sometimes they haven't gotten the pieces yet, that's true. We have to figure out how to get them. But even when they do get all the pieces, sometimes it just doesn't come out right. And I know a lot of you have shown me essays from tests where, God, all the points are down there, but they're not connected, and they're disjointed, and they're incomplete. But if you take all of these things and you put them together, you come up with something, sort of. But it's the organization of all that information. I think this is a concept that keeps coming up over and over again with learning disabled students, that they have the pieces, but they can't put them together. So it becomes important for us at an institution like Marymount, I think, to help them learn how to put those pieces together. And I think that's what we do so well here, and I think that we want to get better at doing. Okay. Another factor that I think comes up frequently with LD students is that they're just not trying hard enough. And we encounter this a lot with students in elementary and secondary school, that their parents tell them they're just not trying hard enough. Okay? And I think sometimes here we tend to do that too. And there are in fact students here who are not motivated. And there are in fact students here that are not trying hard enough. And some of them are learning disabled. But I'm hoping that this will maybe give us an idea of what it's like. Can anybody see anything in there?
And a bear.
Who's saying that? Have you seen this before?
I've seen it before, but I had forgotten, but I'll see it again now.
Did you see it? Don't say it yet.
Right.
Does anybody else see? You see something?
It's taller than
It's
that.
a bird up on the left, and it's got its beak out.
I see a bear.
I see a turtle.
A bear and a turtle.
Turtle. Well, I've gotten the turtle response lots of times. But the point I want to make is that sometimes a student is right there in front of them, and those of you who have seen this before know in fact what it is clearly right in front of your eyes. And when I tell you what it is, you will be really surprised. When I look at this now, people that I've talked to can tell you I have been all around this campus to find out if people in fact can't see what's in that picture. Because to me it is so obvious right now. But the point is that it's motivation. If I tell you, try harder. Try harder. It's like, a little kid that's got a temperature and, you want to, if I give you $5, will you lower your temperature? If I give you $1, can you see what's in there? Try Bob. Motivation. Bob, what's in there?
Yeah, I can see it.
Cow.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a turtle.
Is that a man?
Can you see that down there?
It's a turtle.
Here's what you're looking
Oh, no. Really?
I don't see that.
I don't see it.
I'm sorry, it doesn't all fit. I put it down
Yeah,
there.
It's a cow.
No.
If I turn it a little bit.
No,
can you see
nose
that?
is down at the bottom of the
I see
picture.
the nose and the eyes,
See
but
the
I don't
cow?
see the rest of the
The
picture.
ears are up there.
We have the forehead, the ears, and the bottom. Oh, yeah, I see it now. Now I see it.
His ears are up here where it's darker. Here's his eye.
Oh.
And here's his snout. Now it's not so clear to you? Why couldn't you see that before? You still don't see it? Well, Sam, we'll deal with that later. It's a cow. Clearly it's a cow.
Oh, yeah. Now you.
There are lots of experiences you can have like this. Joe, as a matter of fact, gave me some other experiences. It's a perceptual skill. It's how you're looking at it, what you're prompted to look for. It isn't necessarily whether you're motivated. Okay, for a learning disabled student, motivation is not necessarily the factor that's making them fail. And I think that they hear over and over again, however, that they are not trying hard enough, and that's real difficult for them. I suppose, Bob, I know you used $1. Did you see that?
That's like 50 cents to be fine.
Oh, catch me right.
Oh,
Okay. All right, let's get into some of the types of disabilities. This first one is real broad, and those of you in psychology are probably going to have a fit at this. But as I worked on this presentation for you, I tried to separate language from processing, and I couldn't do it, particularly in terms of dealing with students at the college level. When we start processing information, and processing then is the analysis of the information that we hear, okay? And the analysis of information that we try to put out, okay? Processing involves the analysis. In terms of college level skills, language can't be separated, okay? We have to think in terms of whether or not the students have the language skills. And it's real difficult for me to talk about any techniques at this level with these kinds of students without incorporating language and processing. And I hope that'll become clear as we go along. As you study learning disabilities and as you diagnose learning disabilities, processing is clearly a totally separate entity. But we have to have language at this level in order, I think, for us to work with our students. And one of the things I think that helps is if we can give students, an overall concept of this is what I want you to learn. This is what we're going to be focusing on in this course. This is the language, the vocabulary of this course. This is how you think in this course. In philosophy and in the hard sciences, it's a different kind of approach. And I think it's real important for us as instructors to give them the kind of set that they have to use in that particular cognitive area. I want to give you an idea of what I mean by giving them the set. I want you to add these figures, okay? 9. These are daemons, by the way.
Just go on the next card?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not there yet. These are daemons, okay? 9. You have the daemon 9 and you add 1, you get the daemon 10. Good. You have the daemon 10 and you add the daemon 2, you get the daemon 12. Good. You have the daemon 3 and you add the daemon 4, you get. You have the daemon 3 and you add the daemon 6, you get daemon 9. You have the daemon 4, you add the daemon 11, you get the daemon 3. You have the daemon 9 and you add the daemon 7, you get the daemon 4. What's the name? You have the daemon 11 and you add the daemon 1, you get. Good, that's right. What if I give you kind of a little different, little more information that you can use in thinking this through? What if I tell you it's like a clock? Like a clock. If you have the daemon 9 and you add the daemon 7, what do you get? There you go. You have the daemon 12 and you add the daemon 2, you get. Okay, now you have the set. I gave you enough information that you were able to process it in a different way. And I think, I hope that point comes clear to you, that if you can give them a little more of a filing system in the content class, they'll have a better way to connect the information. In the literature lately, they're calling it a sameness, which seems like a funny approach to me, but they're saying a sameness. When you, in your content area, analyze information, you do it, it's second nature to you. When you look at a philosophy book or a math book, or if you look at a paper a student turned in English or in history or something else, you can look at it quickly and you know what's missing. There's no clear thesis there, or they've missed up the signs, or something particular sticks out to you. Whereas when I look at it, or when someone in a different discipline looks at it, it takes us longer, doesn't it, to figure out. I mean, I have to read the paper 3 times in the Learning Center before I finally figure out, oh my God, there's no thesis in this paper. But you are able to pick that out much more quickly as an English teacher. In philosophy, I think there are particular ways that you analyze a way of thinking. And usually the textbooks are organized in that way. It's important for us to help the students to see that. I think what happens is it becomes second nature to us, but it isn't second nature to them. Any expert has developed that knowledge as a second nature. I wish I could pull out some more examples for you, but this is a journal that is in the library, and we started ordering it. But there are like 2 journals. This is the Journal of Learning Disabilities, and you might want to refer to it every now and then if you're interested. It's great reading. But there are 2 or 3 journals that deal particularly with sameness, okay, the concept of sameness, and teaching students how to use that. But the articles are devoted to different disciplines. So there's one on science, and there's one on social sciences, and there's one on spelling, and there's one on math. So you might want to check them. I have them now in the Learning Center. If anybody particularly interested in their discipline, we can look it up. And I think you might get a lot more out of the reading than I was able to get for your discipline. But anyway, so that's the concept that they're talking about, the sameness. And along with that, I just want to mention task analysis. Is that a familiar concept, everybody? Okay. Analyzing what it is you want them to learn and what are all the skills that are involved in learning that. And with learning disabled students, particularly when I was teaching at the lower level, task analysis you couldn't escape from. And that's what we do, particularly math is a real easy one to task analyze. And in the Learning Center, of course, we're able to back up and figure out where in this skills sequence, a student is falling out. It's a little more difficult in English or in philosophy or hard science or something. But I think that if we can analyze the skills that are involved in what we want them to learn, and you can do that better in your disciplines than I can, although maybe if we sit down together, we can come up with the skills, breaking the task down to figure out where it is the kid is falling out. What types of question on an exam are they blowing? You know, are they failing on the essay exam? We can analyze what was involved in that. A lot of time it's simply how they're reading the question. How they're reading the question for true and false and that type of thing. But we can maybe together come up with a way of analyzing the skill that you are finding the student isn't succeeding with. So I think task analysis is really important. Sometimes it's really no big secret. I found, and I use math as an example, and also English, for what it is that they're doing wrong, and trying to just find an easy way to correct it. I give the students cards that they just carry with them. It just has the cues on it. For a quote, for example, just 3 little questions they have to ask themselves, because as they're writing their paper, they forget a step. They forget to say who said the quote. They forget to analyze what it was. They usually don't forget to put the quote in because that takes up space. But if they just have a little card that they can carry with them that gives them the hint as to what it is, we're kind of giving them the set. We're giving them the outline. And for word problems, I give them cards as well, cards for signs, just the little rules of the signs, and how to begin to solve an equation. So I think sometimes we feel like we're giving them those steps, but we aren't outlining them specifically. I know that the art teacher gives the kids, the students, they have to memorize a lot of different facts about the art that they're studying. But they haven't got a real firm outline in their head of what it is they've got to learn, although it's the same for every painting. The outline is just really important to give them the idea of where they're going. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? I'm just talking. Oh, God.
You mentioned things like providing students with the context and the steps. Do you know if providing things like advanced organizers particularly helps LD students?
Yes.
It does.
Yes.
So if you had a class where you knew that you had a number of LD students, or even just one, then it would be helpful to those students if you gave some sort of advanced organizer.
Yes, because then they have an idea of what's coming. Usually the advanced organizer has vocabulary skills in it. It's invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And I even suggest, for every new unit that you're studying, or particular, of course, for the whole class, but usually the syllabus that you do is really pretty thorough, and I think usually gives them an idea of the class. But it's really important for each unit that you cover, that they have the vocabulary ahead of time, that they have the reading ahead of time. And we don't always get the LD students to do it. We don't always get all of the students, a lot of the students, to read ahead. But they need that background of information before they start. I think it's real important that we give some sort of an assignment to them ahead of time so that they start to get the idea. Study skills, making up questions from that chapter or something in that regard.
Are you, let's see if I formulate this, you're talking about these cards and things like that. Is the supposition here is that they work enough with these cards they will learn to do without the cards?
Exactly. And while they're using the cards, what particularly the LD student needs to do is to verbalize those steps. So when you're solving an equation, for example, in a math class in the classroom, I know it's difficult because you've got a lot of students in there, but as they're solving them, they should be saying what it is they're going to do next. Let me see if I can give you an example. Probably going to be distinct.
I'll give you a perfect example if you want to step back one step from that. That is when you take something from a word problem to an equation, you can separate a lot of students right at that point. And the one book we're using is Johnson and Stephenson, I believe, for 50. It's they spent a lot of time practicing how you turn yourself into a translator to take a word into an equation form and this exercise, which I think is fantastic. I mean, it's just with Dr. Word there.
And then when they're solving them, when they come to me or to some of the other math tutors in the Learning Center, we try to use that process and tell them, for example, if we're doing this, okay, first you have to stop and you have to look at it, okay, then what's your next step?
Isolate the unknown.
Okay, we have to get the X's by themselves on one side, okay? So the X's have to be by themselves, so what do I have to do? I'm not gonna talk in here. Okay, we have to subtract this 2, right? Okay, so that's the next question you ask yourself. How is this 2 connected to this? Okay? It's added. What's the opposite of the adding? Subtracting. So I have to subtract the 2. If I do it over here, I have to do it over here. Okay? You go back. And we always work left to right, and we go back and forth, so you develop a rhythm. And I think what happens is they don't develop that rhythm, and they don't verbalize the steps that they're doing. So every equation they look at is a whole new ballgame. Okay? So it's so important that they verbalize those steps that they have to go through. They have to say them out loud every time. Even if they don't solve that equation, they've got to say what it is they're going to do out loud, the steps. And not just subtract 2 from the side. You have to go through the whole process. How is this 2 connected? Okay. We have to get the X's on, I'm going to get the X's on this side. I look at this, how is this connected? Okay, I'm going to subtract it here, then I'm going to subtract it here. All of that language is so important. And particularly as we get into the dyslexic student, if we ever get to them, because of the space, they have so much trouble with where things are in space. And math, for example, is all space. They have to verbalize the language so that the language, saying it and hearing it, can help them deal with the difficulty in space.
Well, my question, and I may be jumping and you can tell me to keep it for later, but the problem is maybe not doing those steps, but what if you have, like we do in remedial classes, maybe 55 or 60% of your class has all of these multiple disorders, and then you have a bunch that don't have any. And so they're complaining as you do all these steps, oh, it's like kindergarten, it's boring, and yet you're trying to meet the needs of, a group that goes like this.
And I think that's a difficulty because the classes are set up not in terms of where they're at. It's such a big category. So yes, I agree, it's a very difficult thing. I guess the only way I would deal with it is like I know you do, is the small group sorts of things where you pair the students up who need that opportunity to verbalize and put in 1 or 2 of the more, the more advanced students mixed with them so that you're sure that they're saying. Or call on them more frequently in class. And for LD students, I know it's like they don't raise their hands. And if you call on them, it's, One thing that they recommend, and I know I did it in the elementary grades, and I don't know whether it would be comfortable for you to do, is to let them know, okay, I'm going to call on you for this one, and I'm going to call on you for this one, and I'm going to call on you for this one. So that when you get to that, they're primed and they know, so that anxiety doesn't attack them. But it's real important that these kids have the opportunity to respond in class because they're missing all of that reinforcement. They're missing, in learning there's so much risk. And the LD students frequently don't take the risk because they've had so much failure. So they've lost all the chance to take risk because they don't respond in class. And the risk is what makes them learn. You have to step over the edge in order to find out that there's only one step there. So I think, the small groups like you do, I know it's really difficult. But getting them to respond in class, I think, is really important. Okay. I want to talk about another kind of processing difficulty, and that's what they call dysnomia, which is word retrieval. And I want you to do a little exercise. So you can tell me what this is. This is one of the main reasons why we grant extra time on exams for students, okay? Because they can't retrieve information, okay? I want you to, we'll do it then. I want to do this little exercise where you say a sentence and then the next person says a sentence that hooks on and then the next person says a sentence, okay? Let's try that. Shall I give you a topic? Let's do Marymount College, okay? Can you come up with a sentence where I started?
Marymount College is a small liberal arts college.
I can cover everything in one sentence. Can you add a sentence? It's got to make sense.
That
ties into our,
The whole thing. Did you prime me that I was going for?
no, I didn't.
Joe, you're
Joe, you're gonna be next. Yeah.
That has a large number of international students.
That contributes to the multiculturalism on campus.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. Now, I want to do the same thing again. You don't have to say the same sentences. Maybe I'll even change the topic so it'll be easier. I want to do the same thing again, but this time, the words that you use, none of them can have the letter N in.
N? What?
No words can have the letter N in them.
N is in no.
N. Okay?
And
Ed, let's see, what should we talk about this time? How about California? Oh, that's right. we better- Texas. Log rolling. Oh, there's an N in there.
Is it Texas or Waldo?
Can't do log rolling, it's got an N.
no,
Texas has no N.
Texas is a large state.
Fine. Texas is a large state. Anybody else want to volunteer?
And it has an X.
And has an N.
Oh! Semicolon. It has an X.
And it has an N in it. Save.
Oh!
Good place to live.
Good place to live. Good.
It also, whoops, it also draws artists.
Stop while
I
you're
better
here.
stop.
Short, choppy sentences. Texas has cattle. You guys are really pretty good. But do you see where it became more difficult? Okay. For students with word retrieval, you know the information. You have a large vocabulary to draw on. But the specific word you want doesn't always come. Or you can think of one sort of close but not quite. Okay. That's the difficulty that they have. They have the information much of the time, but they can't pull it up as quickly, okay? You're generally very facile with language, but when you have a restriction placed upon you, it's harder for you to draw it up. This is why we give extra time on exams, because they can't pull it up as quickly, okay? It's in there. It's sort of like a victim of a stroke, but that's more of a phasic kind of a behavior. But if when a person has had a stroke or something like that, the language just will not come to them as quickly as out. Okay? Along with this, it's the processing, the amount of time that it takes them to process the information. If I ask you a question like, who was the first president of the United States, you can answer me very quickly. For the student with learning disabilities, they've got to think now, okay, who? Okay, that must be a person. Okay, was. That means they're not anymore. The first, okay, that was the one at the very, very beginning. And president, okay, that's the one in Washington, D.C. By the time they've got the answer, the class has moved on. And again, they haven't gotten any reinforcement, okay, because they processed their information, but it took them longer.
Is it detrimental then to fill in that word that you know, that they know? Or, I know we should just wait to give them a chance to answer. So at what point, is it okay to say?
I think, in the classroom, because it becomes so embarrassing for them, it's okay to fill in so that they can get the rest of their thought out, okay? Because the thought is usually there, but it's the specific word, okay, that won't come to them. Or sometimes when they're doing a math problem, it's like, oh my God, I used to do those, but I'll be darned if I can remember what it is I'm supposed to do. And it takes longer. It's like a fog, that you have to come through, that the student can't quite bring his attention to the problem. It just takes longer to process the information. That's where all the language cues come in. And sometimes when we grant a student with learning disabilities a private time to take an exam, an accommodation, that means they're off by themselves and they can talk their way through it. That language is so important.
That means any kind of, like, you want to read a very short paragraph on the side in class, it'd be very extended.
Yes, it's difficult for them to pull up the information they want. If they know something about drinking and driving, but geez, to come up with it is very difficult for them. Okay, vocabulary becomes really important. We do a lot of work on vocabulary on the campus. But vocabulary isn't all that counts. Students can have a pretty good sense of vocabulary might understand all of these words, and they might understand all of these words, but when they show up on a test or in a textbook, particularly on a test because that's where you're more involved, they can't put all of that information, all those isolated words together and understand what is written. Do you see that? Anybody get that reading it the first time through? I mean, besides Sandy. We may know what all the words mean, but when you start putting them into a complex language structure, it becomes very difficult. I think that what we can learn from this is that on a test, for example, when we have these questions that are this long, for the learning disabled student to process what that information was, you saw what it took to process the question, who's the first president. In order to figure this out, they have to break down all of these little pieces. Break it into individual words or individual thoughts, phrases, sentences before they can process what it all means. But please don't ask me to explain it.
If you give them enough time, can they do that?
Generally. There are some who haven't learned it yet. And this is where, I feel kind of guilty when I was working with students. In order to get them to comprehend, I just kept giving them things to comprehend, okay? But, because we never had any techniques. The researchers never gave us any techniques to teach these kids how to figure out what that meant. And I think we do that a lot in reading classes all the way through school. We don't teach them how to pull out the meaning. There are ways to do it. To start at this level, however, is pretty hard. And when the kids come to me in the Learning Center, we have some techniques that we can use to teach them, but unfortunately, this is what they're being expected to do right now, and they don't have time to back up and learn how. Now, when the kids are really troubled, I have recommended that they go someplace and learn how to do this. Our reading classes try to work on that, but again, you've got a lot of students with varying problems. You've got the ESL student, and you've got the kid that just never studied in high school. You've got the kid that just doesn't have a good vocabulary. And additionally, you have the LD student who maybe has vocabulary, but can't pull out the meaning in a complex sentence like that. So yes, we have to teach them how to break that apart. We use, one technique we use is to give them colored blocks, and you attach the meaning for each of the phrases to a block, or you create a picture. The research kind of shows us that learning disabled students don't create pictures. They don't visualize, which is one reason why their comprehension isn't good. So we create the visual picture, and then we connect them all together. This helps too for the kids that maybe can read it, but they don't remember it even after they've gotten through. So yes, there are ways to teach them to do that, but unfortunately it's kind of hard when we get here, and it does take them a while to catch up.
You said that in some cases you recommend that they go somewhere else. What kind of situation, where?
The one place that I have recommended is up in San Luis Obispo, where they teach reading comprehension. It's the only place that I think has ever figured out how to do it. Many of the community colleges offer that technique on their campus. It's called visualizing and verbalizing, again, verbalizing. And some campuses offer it. Many of the community colleges have people trained in that technique on their campus. We try to do it as we pick them up, as they come through. And a lot of them develop the skill because they go back and they learn how to pull out main ideas and supporting details in the reading classes. But I think sometimes it's even broader than that. Okay. Let me see right here. So what do we do for this student? Time. This student particularly with processing difficulties needs time. We give them time so that they can respond in class, so that they can get the reinforcement that they need. We give them time to connect their thoughts together so that they can put it down on paper in an exam. This, even in the research, is the greatest gift that we can give to our students. And for those of you who are concerned about granting extra time for test taking, this is something that these kids will get all across the United States. there are some books that are available on the market that tell us the kinds of services that are available. These, by the way, thanks to admissions, programs for learning disabled students. All the best colleges and universities across the country, even if they don't have tutorial support, grant extra time for exams. So it's not something that they're not going to be able to get when they leave here. And that's something I'm real careful about when I grant services to students, that I don't grant them something that I don't think they're going to get anyplace else, because it's unrealistic. And when they leave here, I recommend to them that they find a school that does offer. You know, if they've used faculty support in the Learning Center, then I try to find them a school that has faculty support where they can get tutoring. If they've used peer tutoring, then we look for a school where peer tutoring is available. If they need additional study skills classes, which hopefully by the time they leave here, they don't need that much of, but we look for the kinds of services that they need. And time for additional time on a test is not an unusual accommodation to grant. These are the kids also that we grant note takers for. Because they can't listen to what the teacher's saying, process what that means, and get it down on paper as quickly as they must do, okay? So we hire someone to take notes in that class that they're in and provide those notes for the student. That doesn't let the learning disabled student forget about taking notes, but it allows them to have someone's notes to compare to theirs to make sure they've gotten all the important points. So that's why we grant that service. Sometimes a student, however, doesn't need a note taker. Sometimes they can use another way. You know what they do? They tape record the lecture. Okay? That I think of that as sort of a less restrictive alternative. I don't want to provide a note taker for a student if they can use a tape recorder and get the information that they need. So sometimes they'll ask you, can I tape record your lectures? And for the most part, that again is something they're going to get all across the nation in almost any university. Frequently, they don't even need to ask for permission. I've always recommended to our students that they come and ask if it's okay. But that allows them then to get that information to go over their notes again later. Now, some of the kids, and we have a couple here, that the writing is just so difficult that it's hardly worthwhile for them to try to take notes. And in that case, the note taker is really good. We have a student with a hearing impairment on campus, so for that student to have to tape record the lecture isn't necessarily going to do the trick. That student needs a note taker in order to be really successful. Okay, vocabulary of your discipline, again, in a technique to help these kids. Before you start a unit or before you start the semester, and I think most of you do this, you go over the vocabulary that they're going to need in that semester. Go a step further, make sure that's in the front of their notebooks before they come to class every day. Be sure that they're learning when they respond to you in class. If they're saying the thing instead of the whatever part of the plant or whatever, Bob, make sure that you're giving them the right language to respond. And modeling is okay, but somehow they've got to begin to learn to think and write in the language of your discipline. So I recommend to them that they keep a list of the vocabulary for the discipline at the front of their notebook for that class, so that as they go through writing papers at home or writing for a test, they've got that vocabulary. And that's something I should mention probably. It sounds like, you know, all the recommendations are what the teacher's supposed to do in the classroom, and that is something that we really don't lay it all onto the faculty member. And I tell the students, it's not the faculty's responsibility. These are the things you have to do. We spend a lot of time, as a matter of fact, Jackie and I have just put together 3 separate handouts just for learning disabled students, the kinds of things they've got to do for themselves. But on there it says, go talk to your professor and tell them that you have this kind of a learning disability. These are the things that have in the past helped you. These are the successes you've had. And see if you and that faculty member can come up with ways that will be more helpful for you to be successful in that class. Okay. I want to go, yes.
Is it acceptable to have them do a test orally? To give them the
Wonderful
questions?
to have them do a test orally, particularly for students that can't express their thoughts in writing. And that's something that I rarely have asked students to do here, because I think that's something that they have to work out with the faculty member. And I personally don't want to suggest that and then have the faculty member say, no way. So that's something I think between a professor and a student is a wonderful thing to do. And I'd be happy to talk to you as a professor about a particular student of where their disability is, and that indeed that would help them.
But are you setting them up for something they're not gonna get anywhere else when they go somewhere?
Not always, because sometimes that's gonna be granted. The one thing, you know, that I think that, especially here at Marymount College, we're a different kind of an institution, I think. Sometimes allowing them to have that success on that exam, or in that class, or in those 2 tests, or whatever, gives them a new incentive and a new sense that they can succeed, because they've encountered so much failure all along through school that they're defeated before they even walk into your class. What I've seen here is for the kids that get that professor that does go that extra mile, that does sitting down and go through the notes with them, that allows them to talk to them in the office hours, all the things you guys, I know you do them all the time. They walk into an exam and suddenly they get a B or an A. My God, that's the first A or B they've ever gotten. That gives them new incentive to go on to the next class. So sometimes that kind of accommodation won't always be needed. Sometimes that'll just build the success factor so that they can go on. Does that make sense to you? So I think it's a wonderful thing to do, and indeed it is done all across the United States. Harvard, Princeton, students are allowed to dictate. I had a faculty member come in and let me type the exam as the student dictated. And it was a tremendous experience for the student. It was a turnaround point that they realized, my God, I do know some information. Because as I talked before about risk, sometimes they think they know the answer to that question, but they're afraid to put it down. So I think that verbally we can give them the opportunity to actually risk taking that chance. Okay, I want to show you a little bit, talk a little bit about dyslexic students. And our time is beginning to run out. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Can you read that? Can you read what that says? Are you trying to make it harder? Thank you. Anybody get it?
Looks like the mindset, Betty, we have to go just up and down.
This is what it's like for the dyslexic student. Okay? These are the students for whom we get books on tape, because they can understand and they can process the information. It's just floating all over the page for them. Okay? They have a lot of trouble tracking across, keeping letters from reversing. It's a spatial difficulty. These students also have a lot of trouble with math. So we make sure that their papers are lined. Make sure that they learn how to use graph paper, for example, to solve problems, because everything's kind of floating. This is the true dyslexic student. This says, come on, said Betsy, we have to pick up this corn. We don't have another. I want you to try another thing. Do this quickly before I run out. The cards I gave you? I want you to take the card. I want you to put it on your forehead. I want you to take your pen or pencil, and I want you to write your name on it.
On the bottom or the top?
Lean it against your head, please. Flat against your head.
Oh, flat, excuse me.
Now write on the
Oh, okay.
You want us to write or print or
Whatever
whatever?
you want.
Uppercase or lowercase?
Whatever you want. That's beautiful, Belle.
Yeah,
All right.
you're not doing it.
Again, this is what it's like. This is what it's like for dyslexic students to try to write. Okay? Stopping to think, okay, which way does it have to go? Is it up or down or left or right, or where is it sitting on the page? We saw what it looks like for reading. This is what it's like for writing. Okay?
On your forehead.
Again, we provide note takers for them in class so that they don't have to stop and think about which direction the letters go. We provide books on tape so that they can hear what those words are and they don't have to try to track all over to find what those words are.
Maybe I'm dyslexic.
These are not the students that have difficulty with vocabulary and language. They are, however, going to often have difficulty with math. Dyscalculia is a difficulty with math. Sequencing, orientation in space, all those kinds of things. I'll just quickly show you this picture of this brain. They finally figured out that there is a neurological base to this difficulty. And it has to do with this area of the brain as information comes in through the visual pathway. This cellular system here, lateral something, with parvo and magno cells, is supposed to discriminate information. Okay? And the magno cells in the brains of dyslexic students are larger than they're supposed to be, and they're disorganized. Okay? And they think that that's what's contributing then to the difficulty with dyslexic readers. It has to do with discrimination, the rate at which you discriminate. And it's also been shown in, they've researched it further in other areas of the brain with the sense of touch and the sense of hearing, that information is not being processed at an equal rate. So there you go. Some of you may have heard about the colored lenses that the Irwin Institute gives out. That's supposed to help that because it slows down the parvo cells so that the magno cells can catch up and help the discrimination. And I have the colored overlays if anybody ever wants to see the difference. We have a few students who use them periodically. But it helps them. It does not help students with other kinds of language disabilities, of course. We're running out of time. I want to give you out, give out another handout. This is reasonable modifications that we grant for students. Like I said, it's just kind of a cookbook of all kinds of techniques that might help. It's long, it's detailed. Some of you may have gotten it from me at our last workshop, but I've added another whole page of ideas, so hopefully that will help. I guess, as time has gone, sometimes if we can sit down together and brainstorm, we can come up with some ideas for particular students in particular classes. And I think that's been helpful to some of you in the past. And I think that, we want to encourage that, because I don't think either one of us can always come up with a solution. But together maybe we can.
Just a quickie, Ruth, there may be instructors who have study tips and metacognitive strategies for their courses that might be valuable for you to have.
Yes.
Also, there may be some materials like your What You Can Do For Yourself handout that you and Jackie put together about how to approach instructors. That might be good for us to have, so
Yes.
we're primed for when they come.
I wanted to have it ready for you today, and it's not quite ready yet. But please, come by. I'd be more than happy. It's 3 separate handouts for learning disabled students: time management, knowledge of themselves, and what they can do to help them in particular classes. And that's something we didn't get to, is some of the emotional things that these kids experience. Some of the behaviors that you're seeing in the classroom are a result of all the failure, difficulty, frustration. They don't understand why sometimes. We have some students here who have never been diagnosed, and I think it's been eye-opening for us that have seen a few students get diagnosed. That knowledge is so empowering. It turns kids around.
That goes along with, I think it's just great we have the student that needs help and you're giving it. What about the student that won't admit he has a
Yeah,
problem?
see, that really is difficult. The only thing that we can't make them. And sometimes they have to fail. They've got to want it badly enough. Sometimes we give them, I was saying earlier that, a student comes in not for the help you want to give them, but for something else. You give them a little bit of help and they experience a little success, and then they, maybe that will help them. We can't make them. All I can do is talk to them about what it means, and that it isn't a sin, that make it be part of who they are. And those are the kids who are most successful.
How do you handle the anonymity question? Do you want everybody to know that these are LD students, or where one of them's always there when everybody else is being handed their papers and they're sitting there and why is this?
Well, I think that
what's going on?
that's important for the student to talk about with the instructor. Most of our LD students who are asking you for additional time on a test are comfortable with who they are, which is why, by the way, I make them come to you instead of me coming to you. That's part of what I see as important. They have to establish the dialogue with the professor.
I'm not talking about that partly, but it's students that are, other students go up and say, why did you let her take an extra half an hour on this test? And I say, well, that person I've got doctor's orders to do that. What's the
I
best
guess,
answer?
one thing I would do is I would talk to the student and tell, this is one thing that's occurring. Do you mind if they know that this is the reason why? Generally, they have their exam in a whole separate situation, so it doesn't become really obvious to the other students. But I don't think it's something to be ashamed of, and I think that's, students have to kind of develop that sense that it's okay if somebody, knows that that's why you had additional time. I guess as an instructor, I would say I had my reasons, There are reasons why. I don't know, has anybody else had to deal with that? I guess I'm not dealing with that particular aspect. Other students question you about why another student had additional time.
Well, see, I can't, going to other campus, I can't get my exams enrolled. So they're gonna take that test then. And then I'm gonna stay with them until they finish, but the other things is a time test, and they have to leave. They have to leave at the end of the class. This one doesn't.
Well, if you know ahead of time, if you could talk to that student and say, in case other kids ask questions, what would you like me to tell them? I mean, you probably know it before you give a
And they
test,
probably
right?
dealt with it before.
Yeah, I would kind of ask that student how they like to be dealt with, and my reaction is that they have a right to understand that there's reasons.
I don't, it doesn't sound very bad to say I have a reading problem. Maybe, they instead of learning disability, that sounds
I know,
worse.
the term is another whole hour's worth of chat. Sandra?
I was just wondering, one of the things that I heard from a student was that the student had attention deficiency
Oh,
syndrome.
yeah, we didn't get to that either. Attention deficit disorder.
Is that what it is?
It's an inability to focus your attention on what you're looking at or listening to, okay? It's a very difficult thing to diagnose, particularly with adults, because it's kind of subjective. With children, it's a little bit easier. Generally, if it is attention deficit disorder, the more structure we can give them, the better. But generally, this is treated by medication. Actually,
Only sometimes.
yeah, it's in my notes for you. It's like your worst day, your worst day when everything's going, your life is out of control, and that's a phrase they use, my life is out of control. But their lives are like that on a daily basis. And this is what we used to call in the elementary grades a hyperactive student, but attention deficit disorder does not necessarily have to be hyperactive, okay? They have hypoactive. They can almost be dreamy, daydreaming, kind of groggy almost, like in a fog, because they're not able to attend. And there's research on that as well, that it's a particular area of the brain that isn't being stimulated properly, so that the attention isn't able to be focused. But these kids, a lot of times, are just out of control and just need someone. The speaker we had 2 weeks ago, Dr. Duran, talked about, a little lower right-hand box, very controlling. These are the kids that I'm very controlling with. You'll do this tonight, and this tonight. Tomorrow you'll do this. Very, very structured. But attention deficit disorder is generally medically treated. With children, it's Ritalin, something to slow the hyperactivity. With adults, they're using, believe it or not, antidepressants. Because what it does is it has something to do, Joe, you probably know more, it has something to do with dopamine, the production of dopamine that allows a person to pay attention, and the brain isn't producing enough. And I guess the way the medication, the antidepressant works is it doesn't allow the brain to stop producing it. There's a message evidently that's blocked to tell the brain to stop producing it, so the brain produces more dopamine than which allows a person to focus their attention more. But it is medically treated. They do what they call an acid test, which is from the ways it's an IQ test, where they take particular subtests, and if those particular subtests are depressed, that's an indication of the attention deficit disorder. And they also take just comments from the person, and how they deal with things, how they deal with stress. These people are usually overcommitted, have difficulty keeping appointments, that type of thing.
Are these disorders generally much more difficult to diagnose than international students who don't have good English skills?
For me,
I would
that's a
think so.
real big issue. We have a couple we've been trying to test right now, because in order for me to test it, they have to have language skills. When they're little, you can test a lot of nonverbal and non-language tasks you can present. at this point, and because I'm not a psychologist, I don't have those kinds of instruments. Do you have a vendor for you? Vendor?
Hold the test? No, I don't have.
That's a non-language test that's kind, do you have?
I can get one. Is that what?
Because we have, that would help, because I have an ESL student now that I wish I could do something. That tells us whether or not they're positioned in space and that type of thing, organization skills. But the instruments that I have that I can use are all language-based. So all we can do is we sit down together and we try to look. I mean, to me, when I test them, it looks like ESL problems. But when I talk to the ESL teachers, like, there's something more going on here. Al's going to go to a workshop on assessing learning disabled ESL
I
students.
think Caroline,
Oh, Caroline's going to. Yeah, that'll be helpful to us. That's a whole new area.
Ruth, maybe one more, because Larry has a class in here.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sensing that he needs to get
I'm
ready.
sorry. 5 minutes ago?
Class
No,
starts at in
what-
5 minutes.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Jean
I was
and
looking at Jean because she had her
No,
hand
I was
up.
just gonna say, I suspect that in some cultures, maybe the disability is not so prominent in that culture until they translate over into our very.
It would
verbal
depend.
wording.
I think, I have a sense that it's going to be present when they're in their own language, because it's learning. And when you ask these kids, yeah, I had trouble. I had trouble in school, you know. And I think that in some cultures, it's not been accepted. We've had kids come from cultures where it's just, learning disability doesn't exist. And yet in the literature now, I see more and more references to international conferences in France and Belgium and all over the world. Asian cultures, I'm not so sure about that.
I'd like to have a follow-up on this because it seems like you have a wealth of information here. You probably
Well,
haven't
I'd
had
love to
time
just sit and chat, you know, but I don't have to prepare a formal presentation. It's not my style.
Well, we need a chance to talk about
Yeah,
these.
to
All
talk
the
about
stuff that we
students
left off.
with strategies that you use or that, you know, one faculty member uses. And I talk to you guys all the time. I know that individually you have lots of great strategies, but if we could share more of them.
Just give us another hour, bring those.